What happens in the server code when you add a watch point? First, let's start by looking at the user interface. When you add a watch point, 3 key pieces of data are gathered on the client side and then passed to the server. The first is what object. The object we click on in the scopes pane must be identified so the client can communicate with the corresponding class that represents that object in the server. And then we need to also pass along the property where we're going to add the watch point. And then we need to also tell the server what type of watch point, either a get or a set watch point. There's a lot of work that is done on the client side that goes into this feature, and there's also a lot of interesting detail about how the client interacts with the server. But at this point, I'm going to skip over those details to get a general overview of how watch points are implemented in just the server. So now that the client has handed off that data to the server, where does it go? It is passed as arguments to a function aptly named addWatchPoint. And where does that function live in the server? Well, in the previous slide, we talked about how we need to locate the correct object in the server so we know where to put the watch point. That object is actually represented as an instance of a class called objectActor, and that is where the addWatchPoint method is. So every object that is in scope will also have an object actor in the server waiting for the debugger client to talk to it. These actors provide the client with important information about the object, and the client can also tell it to do work, like adding a watch point, as I'm going to demonstrate. So the second server requirement is that the addWatchPoint method needs to attach a function to the property that will run every time that property is used. So for example, if we have a set watch point on A, and A is reassigned to another value like 2, then our function that we've attached to that property, which I've named run on property set, needs to run. And if you look at the third bullet, the body of run on property set needs to make a call to pause debugger, and that function pause debugger is responsible for obviously pausing the debugger. And so that is where the implementation gets really interesting. The obvious big question here is how can we make sure that this run on property set function runs anytime the property is used? The answer to that takes advantage of a few features of the JavaScript language, and I'll briefly go over those features before explaining how they're used in the addWatchPoint method. So in JavaScript, every object property has a property descriptor, and that descriptor is just an object that contains information about the property. So I'll demonstrate this by just creating a simple object and getting the descriptor for it using this getOwnPropertyDescriptor method that is on the object constructor. And so it returns an object with properties, and the specifics of these properties aren't important right now. But what's important is how you can actually modify this descriptor using object.defineProperty. So looking at the MDN documents for this method, you can see in the first example that defineProperty needs the object, and it needs the property, and then you pass in an object with options that change the descriptor. So most of these options aren't relevant for the WatchPoints implementation, but if you scroll down, you'll see get and set, and these are relevant, and I'll show you how they work. So I want to use defineProperty to add a setter to the A property's property descriptor. And this function is simple. It just logs the string set function ran. And the expectation is that the set function will run anytime the A property is set. So let's test that. just going to set A to 2. And you can see the statement is printed, proving that the set function has run. We can do the same thing with the get method. So we can just change this to get, and we can test it out by just accessing A. And you can see that the get function ran message printed to the console. Going back to the second server requirement, remember that the goal was to set up a function called runOnPropertySet that would run anytime A is assigned a value. And the same would go for a get watchpoint. So anytime A is read, a function that I would call runOnPropertyGet should run. And we can use the object.defineProperty method that I just demonstrated to create that behavior. So this is what we have so far for the add watchpoint method, and I just added the use of object.defineProperty. So the add watchpoint method is on the object actor, and it is passed a property and the watchpoint type. So if the watchpoint type is set, we'll enter this first block, and we'll use object.defineProperty to add a setter function to the property. And you can see that the body of the setter function makes a call to another part of the server that's responsible for pausing the debugger. And then if the watchpoint is a get watchpoint, we'll enter this block, and instead of adding a setter function, we will add a getter function to the property. Now this is a simplified version of the final add watchpoint method in the server, but it's a good starting point for understanding the server-side code for watchpoints.